Hello, everyone. Welcome aboard. And so today I wanted to do another little episode for this midweek podcast. And so I think what I'm going to try to do here is towards the start of the week, I want to do my main podcast where I'm doing discussing some games, and then the main bulk of like an ongoing discussion that I'm having. So, for example, I'm starting off with going through the years in gaming. So we left off on 1981, and also do my little relay of gaming, little game that I do, and then talk a little bit about modern gaming stuff, and then just kind of overall video game discussions. But for the midweek one, I think what I want to do is have a bit more of a focused structure where I'll be doing like either a top 10 or a top, might be even top 50 or whatever, countdown of just my favorite something, right, that has to do with video games. So, for example, today what I wanted to talk about is counting down my favorite video game consoles of all time. And so I think when I do these, though, they may not necessarily be like in order, so I might just have like my 10 favorite of something, and not necessarily in order, right? Just 10 things that I like. But this one is, it is like a countdown list. And so, of course, this is all subjective. These are just my thoughts on this. And I'm only doing consoles that I've had some experience with, and ones that are, had some kind of market relevance, and not doing the second generation just because with the second generation, while I did have some experience with it, I don't have a whole lot. So I'm going to be starting more with the third generation move going up. And this will be for home consoles, so I won't be doing handhelds on this one. Maybe I'll do. I want to do something with the handheld systems, as I've been getting a little bit more experience with those. But for right now, this is just the handheld, or I'm sorry, the home console systems. And so I don't really have any. There's no like definitive science behind how I categorize these. It's just I just had a look at what I think about the overall. The main thing is the gaming library that's on this console, the exclusives on it, the hardware itself. I took into some consideration like certain unique aspects about the console, if any, that might have, swayed my vote a little bit higher or lower on where it ranked. And there'll be a few sort of, I guess, side consoles, I guess you can say. You'll see what I mean, because I feel like their library of these were fairly substantial. This mainly has to do with Sega, as you'll see here in a bit. But yeah, just wanted to kind of rank these here and all, and on what I ultimately thought about them. And so for most of these are pretty set in stone for the most part, but some of it might be switched around, just depending, I guess, on how I'm interpreting this list here. But mainly it does come down to the gaming library on there, and how, why do I want to go back to this console and play it, right? Because whether if it's, again, the games or something about the console itself, or exclusives and whatnot, the ease of accessibility to also will come into play a little bit as well too. But otherwise, I am for the most part judging them based on from when they were market relevant and what I feel that they did to the industry, but more so on for me personally, though. But like I said, all subjective. Definitely let me know what are your favorite consoles, because I'm always kind of curious to see where some consoles rank for some people. But I got 28 of these, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on each one, since we have several of them to get to. But I'll touch base a bit on them and go over some of my favorite games on them as well too. But coming in at number 28 is the Atari Jaguar. And so this system came out back. It was one of the first systems that came out, what was considered the fifth generation. And some of the systems that were coming out at the start of that generation, there was a lot of duds. And so this was one of them. I guess it was one of the more popular duds, I guess you can say, but it definitely was a bit of a dud. And it was Atari trying to come back into the console space with a 64-bit system, but it just ultimately, it failed. And when I've played some of the games on it, and via emulation, and then also there was a Atari compilation that came out a few years ago, and it had some Jaguar games on there. But from what I played of it and all, there's not a whole lot to the system really. And I mean, they were touting it as being a 64-bit system, but looks like there's some debate on that if it really was, as it seems to be. I guess the architecture of the system almost seems like it's more of a 32-bit system, but it can get away with 64 bits just because of a certain way I guess the hardware is. I don't know the whole technicality of it and all, but basically it's I mean, it's a system that had some potential. It seems like it was hard to program for, but ultimately, because it just wasn't a very popular system and it failed pretty quickly and all, nobody really probably got the chance to try to harness the full power of it. And it only came out with, so many games. And there was even a CD add-on to it that only had, even a smaller portion of games. So there's not really a whole lot to it. And so what I've played of it, a lot of it is, pretty forgettable, or the games that were somewhat decent on it. I mean, it eventually ended up, they eventually ended up going to a different console anyways. And, with, in some ways, even a better version of it. So, I mean, there was, Rayman, which was probably one of the better games on it, but it eventually went out to the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn and all. But it played decently, what I've played of it on the emulation anyways, on the Atari Jaguar. And the nice thing about it too is that no loading. But probably the one that was a more popular one that never got a re-release, as far as I know, was the Aliens versus Predator. And I always wanted to play it back then as a kid, but because it just looked pretty amazing in the screenshots. Now, when I've gone to it, it's decent. It's a very old school first person shooter, and it's a bit slower pace as well too, at least up to the point that I've played it. And so it hasn't aged the best, but it's still cool to look at it and all, and just kind of see where first person shooters were at the time. But yeah, but other than that, not a whole lot to this library. And so, in the console itself, so I'm gonna place it pretty low. I mean, like I said, it bombed. Not a whole lot of games for it. The only reason I would recommend you checking it out is if you just really have a nostalgia or a curiosity about it, just consoles of the past. But coming in at number 27 is the Panasonic 3DO. And this one, again, came out roughly around the same time that the Atari Jaguar did. So both of these would have come out, I want to say, in late 1993, I think. So we were getting fifth generation systems around that time. And again, a lot of these were, they didn't do that well because there were several others, like the Town Marty. There was was it Amiga? I think they had one, or Bandai maybe. I forgot. But there were several others, but again, none of them just really did that good. But the Panasonic 3DO it had ambition for sure, and it had a bit of a vision. And so from what I understand of the system was that one of the main people behind it was he was a main person for EA at the time, and Trip Hawkins. And so it kind of seemed like they were wanting to make the system to be sort of a catch-all for all games to be put over on it, where kind of like, like movies, right? You can have a VCR, but it plays all movies. It sounds like they were trying to do something like this with the 3DO. And there was a lot of people that were making the Panasonic. So it wasn't just Panasonic. The 3DO, but it wasn't just Panasonic. It was several others. But I think that the plan just wasn't perhaps well implemented, and they couldn't get people like Sega and Nintendo on board. And so ultimately it just kind of failed, fairly quickly too, also, especially when the PlayStation and the Saturn ended up coming out. So it had an idea, but it just perhaps a little bit too ambitious, and it was crazy expensive too. I mean, at the time it was $700. I mean, that was insane. But when it came out though, the graphics were pretty impressive. And it was, they had cool technology behind it for sure. And it was a CD-based system. But like I said, it just perhaps the whole business side of it and all, and how they were trying to market this and all, it just wasn't able to compete ultimately. And I think a lot of that had to do with, again, Sega and Nintendo just already being the established brands, and they didn't go on to the system. But, there was another company that ended up making a successful system, and that was a PlayStation. And I think ultimately it just comes out they just marketed their strategy a lot better than Panasonic, or, the whole 3DO as a whole did. But yeah, that's all I got on that, on the Panasonic 3DO. And actually, I almost forgot. So I probably should have looked at my list before I said something at the start. I do have 2 second generation systems on here. So starting with number 26 is the Atari 2600. And there's a vast library of games on this system. And while I do feel when I've gone back to it, the graphics definitely, don't hold up that well. It's very archaic now, but it does have some fun games on there, for like the versions that it had on there for, like, let's say, for example, Asteroids, or I think, what was it, Pitfall and all. I mean, they're serviceable versions of the games, and Centipede and whatnot, but definitely downgraded from the arcade versions and all, which were already, I guess, archaic by today's standards. But there was a vast majority of oh my God, I can't talk. A big library of games on there. So there's definitely, you'll find something on there to at least have some fun with. But, these systems from the second generation, they just haven't aged the best and all. And so that's why I still had to place this one fairly low. But it was a very important system, though, because it really made popular, at least for a while, the concept of owning a game console at home. And even though, we had the whole video game crash and everything of 1983, the base establishment was set there with this system, right? With the Atari 2600 that, Nintendo eventually kind of picked up on afterwards. But I mean, there's a lot of stuff on this system. And so at the very least, you'll have some kind of enjoyment with it. And then at number 25, I have the Magnavox Odyssey 2, and which wasn't as popular as the Atari 2600, but I have it on here because that was the one that I did own back as a kid. And I do feel that some of the games and the graphics just held up better than on the Atari 2600. I can go back and play Casey Munchkin or Casey's Crazy Chase and still have fun with that one. Or there's like the Cosmic Conflict, which is, it's simple but fun. Or the bowling game is fun, or even the basketball game is pretty fun with 2 players. So I do get some enjoyment, right, if I were to play on the Magnavox Odyssey 2 more so than the Atari. And then nostalgia also just kind of places this one a bit higher than the Atari. All right, but then at number 24, I have the Sega 32X. And so this was an add-on to the Sega Genesis, but I feel like it's enough of its own system to warrant its own space here, right, as its own individual console. And I mean, it had not a large library of games, but it had, games that were exclusive and unique to it. And so, but kind of with the Jaguar and the Panasonic, it was early in the 5th generation. It came out roughly around the same time that the Sega Saturn did in Japan anyways. When the 32X here in the States, I think they came out at around the same time. But it was, it was just a failed, a failed concept that might have sounded good on paper at first, but it ultimately just was one of the things that led to the downfall of Sega, where they were just pumping out just a whole lot of hardware and accessories and all that. And, I just don't feel like they had a really clear vision to just focus on one console, as which should have been the Saturn, instead of just trying to do multiple things. And so ultimately the system wasn't supported very well, and there's just not a whole lot to it. But I do prefer it over the Panasonic 3DO and the Jaguar, just simply because I like Sega and I like Sega games. So it has stuff like an almost arcade perfect port of Space Harrier and Afterburner, and then Knuckles Chaotic, which is, it's a decent Sonic-like game. And really, because of those right there, just kind of what places it higher than the Jaguar and the 3DO for me. But that's not really saying much. Like I said, the 32X, there's not a whole lot there. I mean, it had decent ports of like NBA Jam and Mortal Kombat 2 and WrestleMania. There was a WrestleMania game on there as well. So not a whole lot on there, but what is there? Oh, and also decent port Virtual Racing and Virtual Fighter, which, again, they're good ports. It's just that they're the first entries of the series. Well, Virtual Racing only had one entry, but but in Virtua Fighter is not the best Virtua Fighter game, but it's a decent fighting game at the time. So really, I mean, that's the only reason I'm placing this one where it is. But yeah, I just can't say that it's really worth exploring unless, again, you just want to go back and out of curiosity. Oh, and let's see. And so then coming in at number 23 is the Nintendo Wii U. And this system I didn't have a whole lot of experience with. It's not, at least not when it first came out. It wasn't until afterwards that I got it, just mainly out of curiosity, and also because I wanted a version of the Wind Waker and Twilight Princess HD, because as of right now, it's the only way to play them, through like that were sold through retail. But it's an interesting concept, the whole gamepad thing. I've messed around with it a bit, and I mean, it's interesting, and I can see where Nintendo was going with this, but it just, the way I guess it was marketed, and the reality is that the gamepad, you can't really take it that far. And at least I know for me, once I kind of figured that out, I was like, well, that's kind of pointless, because you like the concept that you can play it on a separate screen and all, but it's like, oh, but I can't really go that far with it, which eventually the Nintendo Switch really perfected a lot better. But it has a decent library of games, though. I mean, for what it is, it's, like Mario Kart 8, Super Smash Bros., and, a handful of other Nintendo games, but there's just better versions of those games that came out later. And so part of the reason why I had this one fairly low is because what's the real reason I go back to? And yeah, Wind Waker HD and Twilight Princess HD are probably really the only main things on the system that I would feel worth going back to. And even though they're nice versions, but there are ports though of, games that were from a previous system. So on its own, there's just not really much to go back to it. And the whole gamepad gimmick of it it's just that it's a very simple gimmick that really didn't pay out for it. So that's why this one ranks fairly low. And so number 22 is a Microsoft Xbox One. And kind of like with the Wii U, and I might almost even flip-flop the Wii U and the Xbox One, but there's just not a whole lot that I can think of going back to the Xbox One, because there wasn't a whole lot of like exclusives for it. And I mean, really, the Xbox One, I owned it. I had and I got it because of Gears of War 4 mainly, which ended up being a bit of a disappointment. But I can't really think of why you would want to own an Xbox One now. Well, I mean, I guess if you got the Xbox One and you didn't care so much about the high-end graphics and all that, and you get Game Pass, then okay, yeah, that's why I place it, I think, a little bit higher, just because it can be, a very cheap system for, let's say, someone that just doesn't really care about having the highest fidelity graphics and all that, because there are several games that are newer, quote, Xbox games, unquote, but that you can play on there because they were cross-gen with Xbox One. But yeah, other than that, I mean, there's just not a whole lot of reasons to go back to this one. And so, I mean, probably my favorite game that I played on it that was let's say, exclusive to it was maybe Gears of War 4, I guess. I can't really think of anything else. But yeah, just, and this is where, unfortunately, it was a bit of a downfall for Microsoft with just the whole way they came about it, with the marketing it as almost like some kind of an entertainment device as opposed to a video game console, and just really focusing on the TV services that you can have on it. And it just kind of led Xbox down a path that I really feel it never recovered from, and where Xbox is at nowadays, for better or worse. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just one of those systems that I just don't have a whole lot of, I guess, memories of or anything to say about, because the system itself was, I guess, fairly well built. The UI was decent, but this is also where we started seeing ads and all that on your UI and all, and I'm not the biggest fan of that. But for what it is, yes, it can play some pretty cool games that are third-party games and all, but again, as far as exclusives go and all, there's just not a whole lot on there. And so not seeing a real big reason, right, that you would want to go back to the system here. Let's see. And then number 21 is the Neo Geo. And so I will say that from the previous systems that I've talked about, they're kind of duds in my opinion, but there's a bit of a leap in quality from here on out, right? Even though this one is, I have this one next to the Xbox One, but with the Neo Geo, I mean, it's definitely a cool system. And it's I mean, the 2D graphics that were on this were really impressive. It was a 24-bit system, which is still considered a fourth generation system, but was 24 bits as opposed to 16-bit like the Genesis and the Super Nintendo was. So you can get some really amazing 2D sprites and animation and all that. Some of the games were really stunning to look at back then. And it's a cool system if you're very much into like arcade style games, specifically fighting games, because that's a lot what the Neo Geo library is. I mean, the system was crazy expensive and the games were crazy expensive. So I didn't know anybody that had a Neo Geo back in the day. But we would play the games in the arcade quite a bit. And so, I mean, the fighting games that were on there were excellent, like Fatal Fury, Samurai Showdown, World Heroes, the King of Fighters, a lot of great fight. And then those series, those games, there was a lot of games in the series of those there. Some of them that are still ongoing as of today, and then had like some cool shooters too, also like Last Resort, Polestar, and then like running guns like Metal Slug, and then just other arcade style games like Cross Swords, and a lot of beat 'em ups on there too also, and some cool sports games as well. So all very arcadey. Not a whole lot other than that on there, but they are definitely fun though, and so I think that it's definitely worth a look to check the system out. There's a lot of the games on the Neo Geo have come out to for like on some of the modern systems. There's the Neo Geo Arcade Archive, I think, line of that you can get on at least I know on the Switch, and so it's a lot of the best games are on there. So that's a good way to check out the Neo Geo library of games, because I'm pretty sure that trying to collect like the actual physical versions are probably still really expensive. But a lot of cool stuff on there though. The Neo Geo was definitely cool, and very, very cool, fun arcade style games if you're into that kind of thing. But let's see. After the Neo Geo at number 20, I have the NEC TurboGrafx 16. Oh, and going back to the Neo Geo, I would say probably my favorite game on there. I would say probably Samurai Showdown too. I do like that game. But the TurboGrafx 16, so it's a cool system. It was the PC Engine, which was how it was known in Japan, was, I guess you can say, the first fourth generation system. Because it is technically 16-bit, kind of 8-bit. Again, I don't know the complete breakdown of how some of these game consoles were made, that they can be considered like 16-bit or 8-bit and all that. But my understanding of the TurboGrafx 16, it was kind of like an 8-bit system, but it had some kind of a processor or something like that was still considered 16-bit. But either way, I mean, I look at the games on the TurboGrafx, and they're definitely a step up from, say, what the Nintendo and the Sega Master System was doing. So I'm going to consider it a 16-bit system. And I haven't had too much experience with the library of this system, but what I played, though, they are pretty cool. And it had quite a bit of games too also, and because it was really popular in Japan mainly. It didn't do a whole lot here in the United States, but it was kind of like like you can say the Sega Genesis or the Super Nintendo were like the Transformers, but TurboGrafx was like GoBot. It was cool, but it just wasn't the most popular. But it definitely has had a bit of a cult following in recent times, as people are just more informed now and all. And so when they've gone back to this system, it's like, wait a minute, there is a lot of cool stuff here. And so, like, for example, games like The Legendary Axe, Splatterhouse, Blazing Lasers, a lot of cool shooters on there. A really impressive port of Street Fighter 2, actually. And some cool racing games, some cool kind of arcade style games. And then if you add the games that were from the TurboGrafx or the Turbo CD, then you get really cool stuff like Castlevania Rondo of Blood. There was the East books 1 and 2, East 3, Wonders of East, I think it's called. And so, Gates of Thunder, Lords of Thunder, cool shooters as well. So cool system. The Bonk's adventure games they're fun too also. So it had a decent mix of like platformers and shooters and some kind of arcade style games. And not a whole lot when it comes to like RPG style. I mean, aside from like the East and maybe the, what are they called, Nutopia 1 and 2. But what is on there though, they are really fun, and it's worth checking out the library for. Again, you can emulate them pretty easily, or if you there's a TurboGrafx 16 Mini that came out a few years ago. If you can track one of those down, that'd be a cool way to experience it too. But probably my favorite game that I played on it, I would say, I mean, if I'm including the Turbo CD, Castlevania Rondo of Blood. I mean, that's an excellent game. But let's see. So next up is on number 19 is the Microsoft Series X/S. And it's kind of sort of like the Microsoft Xbox One. Again, there's not a whole lot to it, not because so many of the games ended up going third party, and the way Microsoft is doing things now is I don't mind it, I guess, too much. We'll have to see how it all plays out, but we are definitely losing that sense of the uniqueness of these consoles because, just again, the direction that they're going. But what I like about the Microsoft Xbox Series X, I guess, is that I do like, this is a system that I have on here because I do like the system itself and then the ecosystem, I guess, of it, because a lot of the games, and all that, there's not a whole lot of exclusives for it, but it does clean up a lot of the games, right, that were from, like, let's say the 8th generation, and then how it's backwards compatible with all the library of the Xbox One, and then also the 360, and then the original, and then several games from the 360 and some games from the Xbox original. I just like that I can have all those Xbox games on one console, and then you throw in Game Pass and then the Xbox Cloud and all that. Is one reason why I do like this Xbox system here. Is just because there's a lot of cool ways you can play it. But again, that's kind of stemming out not just the console itself. It's just sort of the whole ecosystem of Microsoft, right, on what they're doing, which we'll see how that all works out. Again, there's a bit of a sadness to me that, again, consoles are just kind of going in a different direction, and all, where it's play anywhere now is what their new slogan is. But it is what it is, but for what it is, I do like the Microsoft Xbox Series X/S for that. And the S I also have just because the way you can, if you get the developer kit on it, or developer mode kit, or whatever it's called, the way you can do emulation on that is actually really great. So I love having that for that there. So again, kind of unorthodox why I like the system on here, why I place it a little bit higher than the systems before it, but I do tend to use it quite a bit for those reasons there. So that's why I do have it up here on this spot here. But then number 18, I have the Nintendo Wii. And with the Nintendo Wii, it's one of my lesser favorite Nintendo systems. And it's just because I am, the motion control thing, which is the big selling point of the system. I'm glad, I guess, at the time anyways, that Nintendo got this win, just because they were not doing so well. But, they tapped into the casual market. And so because of that, they found a lot of financial growth, but it definitely put them on a different path as far as where they were doing their own thing, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And there was some unique experiences on the Wii. So, like Super Mario Galaxy, the Legend of Zelda games that were on there, but the Wiimote, it is a gimmick. It's the Nintendo games that were on here were excellent. And that's why I have this one, a bit higher than what I normally thought I would originally, because again, those games like, Mario Galaxy, the Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess was fun to play on there. And, Skyward Sword was, it was cool. Metroid Prime, the whole trilogy, it's really fun to play on here as well. And because those games are so excellent, I do have some respect for the system. But outside of that, like a lot of like third-party stuff, there's probably a handful of games that I can think of, if I really wanted to, that I had some fun with. But it is kind of a more forgettable Nintendo system, and that's why I don't have it up too high. But like I said, I did have some fun with it, and I can't deny that the Virtual Console, because that was kind of a new concept back then, was very cool to me back then because it helped me get caught up on a lot of like fourth generation and third generation games that I never got to experience back then. Because this is when I was an adult and had some money to spend, and so I was able to catch up on some of those games there, like especially the Super Nintendo. And so that was kind of cool to, have that there. But as a stand on its own, I like having the system around and all because it does have some fun games on there. But, again, it's one of my lesser favorite Nintendo systems. And then at number 17, I have the Sega Master System. And with this system here, it was my first main system that I really started falling in love with gaming. I had the Magnavox Odyssey 2 at first, but then we got the Master System. So when everyone else had the Nintendo Entertainment System, this is what we had. And so because of that, there's a lot of games on there that I just fell in love with back in the day. And it was really what started my love for gaming. But when I go back to the library, there's still a lot of fun games on there for sure. But, some of the stuff just hasn't aged the best and all. But it definitely has some cool stuff there, and has one of my favorite games of all time, Phantasy Star, on there. But also games like Govelius, Wonder Boy, The Dragon's Trap, and Double Dragon. The ports of Afterburner and Outrun, I think, are still fun on it, and so a lot of cool stuff on there, still. But it is one of my least favorite Sega systems now. When I put it up. When I stack them up to the rest of them. And so that's why it falls a little low here. But the nostalgia, though, is definitely strong with this one. And it was a good system, though. It had it had some cool accessories to it and all. And it had all the games that came out, like, for example, in Brazil and in Europe, that would have really bolstered the library even more to make it even better. I don't think to take down Nintendo, but if you put those games on top of the ones that came out here in North America, then you have a pretty decent system from the third generation, and a lot of hidden gems on there. So this is a system that I would definitely recommend to check out the library of. It's easy to emulate, or if you can track down like the original console and games, that's that'd be cool too. But yeah, it's really, you're going to come across some really colorful games, really fun games. And some of the games might even surprise you on just how well they were done on there, that were arcade, converted from the arcade. Again, you're not getting the arcade experience completely as far as visuals and all that, but the gameplay there is still pretty solid though. So it's, it was a good little system, and definitely worth, at least for me, right, for Phantasy Star. Let's see. But then after that, on number 16, I have the Sony PlayStation 5. And, with the 9th generation, it's been one of my least favorite generations. But the PlayStation 5, though, it does have some pretty cool games on there. And again, another, one thing about the PlayStation 5 that I really like about it too, kind of with the same thing with the Series X, is that I like that it's backwards compatible with the PlayStation 4, that it has a lot of, not some of my more favorite ways of playing them, but it has some PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 2 games and all, right, that I can play on there. Even, some of them are streaming and all, but you do have a way of playing them on there. And kind of the same thing with the Xbox. So that Series X that I forgot to mention is also the SSD loading, or the hard drive. I got to say, I love the faster loading. It's great, and all. And then also how it upscales and improves the performance on a lot of 8th generation games and all. That's pretty cool. But there is some decent stuff on there. Like, I really like Final Fantasy 16, and Returnal is cool. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, Spider-Man 2. So it's not like it's, there's no good games on there. It's just the generation as a whole, right? For 9th generation has been a bit disappointing for me. But, at the same, there has been some cool stuff though. So I definitely can't deny that. And the power of the PlayStation 5 and the PlayStation 5 Pro, it's pretty impressive. And again, I'm a console player, so I don't, I'm not too familiar with PC, so I can't get into I know PC can be better and all that as far as power goes and all, but for more of a user-friendly setup, right? For, if you want to plug in a system to the TV and all that, that's why I tend to go for consoles more. And the power under the hood on the PlayStation 5 Pro and the Xbox Series X, it's pretty impressive. I mean, I'm happy enough pretty much for the most part with the power that I'm getting on these systems, and nitpicks here and there, but I do like what's under the hood on these. I just wish that there was more games that would take advantage of, I guess, what this generation could bring. But what is there though, it's not bad, and I would say that out of like the Series X and the PlayStation 5, the PS5 is the one that takes it for me for this generation so far. And coming in at number 15 is the Nintendo Entertainment System. And I have this one a bit low for being such a legendary console, just because, again, a lot of the games from the third generation, I mean, I can still go back to them and have a lot of fun with and all. And there's still some games on the system that are, some of my all-time favorites still. Like, I still have fun with the Super Mario Brothers, The Legend of Zelda, Super Punch Out, are some of the ones that stand out. I really like Foxanadu. I think that's a great game, one of my favorites of all time. But the I guess as I get older and older, some of these games, while I can still enjoy them and the nostalgia is strong, they are just getting a little too simplistic and archaic for me now. And so because of that, I do place the system, maybe not as high as I know that the pedigree would suggest, maybe that I would place it higher. But for what it did for the industry and all that, I mean, it can't be denied that Nintendo really put gaming on the map. And I mean, I guess you can say Atari kind of did, but Nintendo brought it back from the shadows after the gaming industry pretty much almost died out. And Nintendo's held on ever since, for good or bad, right? And even back then, right, with some of their business practices and all are a bit, shady. But you can't deny that when they make good games, they do make good games that just are legendary and timeless as well, too. Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why a lot of their big franchises have held on, to this day. But just as the system as a whole, it's, it has some good games on it still, but they can be a little rough now to go back to and play. But definitely, but big library of games, so you'll definitely at least find something there that's worth playing. And coming in at number 14 is the Nintendo 64. Now, here's one that I could potentially flip-flop also with the previous entry for the Nintendo Entertainment System. With this one here, I didn't get a whole lot of experience with it until a bit later on. It wasn't, let's see, so the system came out in 1996, but it wasn't until 1999 that I ended up getting it. And it was mainly because of Ocarina of Time that I just wanted, I wanted to play it. But then eventually got to playing some of the other games on there and ended up liking some of them. I mean, I can definitely see why the system had a small library of games, but some very quality games as far as, well, at least for that time. And I can see why this system just has a lot of nostalgia for a lot of people, as some of these games were really groundbreaking, because it had, I mean, just with Super Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, you have two of some of the best games of all time, at least, in the public's eye, right, and all what are considered some of the best games of all time. And then you also have things like GoldenEye 007 for the, I mean, the game probably hasn't aged the best, but for what it did for multiplayer back then was a big deal. And just the system overall with multiplayer, with the, 4-controller port that it had in the front. And I mean, the system was marketed as, I think on the box, this is something like the fun system. And because that's where Nintendo kind of started shifting a little bit here in this generation. And I think they had to, just because what Sony was doing and all was just taking over a big chunk of the market, what Nintendo used to have, which is just being the system for everyone, right? As far as, having their own Nintendo games, but then also having a lot of third-party stuff, because the Nintendo 64 didn't have a whole lot of third-party support. And because that was all going to Sony, but so they had to, go a different approach here with the Nintendo 64, and also because it was cartridge based. And so that limited as far as what developers could do on it. But the games that came out for it, specifically from Nintendo and also Rare, because you had like Banjo-Kazooie and all, just really made it a system that, even though it wasn't as popular as a PlayStation, but I feel like a lot of times people that owned it and all have more fond memories of the Nintendo 64 because of the games that they had, they were really absorbed into. And so, there's not a whole lot of games, I guess, that I can say that I really like on this one, but the ones that I do like are very, very good. So again, with Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Killer Instinct, Blast Corps, Jet Force Gemini, I think that's what it's called, and then also Conker's Bad Fur Day. That game's hilarious. And of course, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which is one of my favorite games of all time. So just for those games right there, really elevated to this position here. And it's not my, again, favorite Nintendo system, and I don't have a whole lot of nostalgia for it. But what I have played and all, I can definitely acknowledge that some of these titles are truly legendary. Let's see. But then coming in at number 13 is the Sega CD. And so here's an add-on, right, for the Sega Genesis, but I felt I wanted to give it its own spot just because I feel that the library of games that were on there was different enough from the Sega Genesis's library, at least the games that I really appreciated on there, and it had a decent amount of games on there. And so the Sega CD, this is going to be one that's a bit nostalgia and a bit also because me growing up as a Sega kid, but it was a system that I feel gets overlooked a lot because the popular take on it seems to be that it's just a system that just had a bunch of full motion video games on there, which it did, and they weren't the best. That kind of game style was just, it was. I'm glad we're done and over with it. But there was a lot of good stuff on here though, and some of my favorite games of all time are on the Sega CD, and so. For example, like things like Sylphid, Sonic CD, Lunar, The Silver Star Story, Lunar 2, Eternal Blue, Snatcher, Shining Force CD, Hemdale, and just those right there, just some that I can just think of Rise of the Dragon. Those are some games that I can just think of off the top of my head. Soulstar, that I feel were really good. They were doing things that the Sega Genesis in most cases couldn't do. And they were just really quality games. Pop Full Mail, that's another one. KO Flying Squadron, I believe it's called. That's another one too. So, again, not a huge, vast library of games, but there's a lot of quality stuff on this. If you can get past the idea that this one just had just a bunch of full motion video games. If you check out the library on it and look up at least those games that I just mentioned right there, you'll find some really good games. And you might even find some other stuff there as you explore the library more if you're just getting outside of the full motion video stuff. Again, part of this is for nostalgia and all. I was one of the only people, aside from another brother and a friend of mine and his brother, that had the Sega CD, but we were like the only ones that I knew that had the Sega CD, but we both loved it. Like, we thought it was an excellent add-on to the Sega Genesis that was differentiated itself enough from its main, from the main Genesis console, that I wanted to give it its own spot. And I want to do a video or a podcast on it at some point because I feel it deserves more eyes on it, or more, I guess, people to listen in on it, on the good stuff about it. Even though I feel like nowadays it is getting it's starting to get a little popular, because some systems nowadays that weren't that popular back then are getting a bit of a resurgence nowadays. Because again, the internet being what it is now and all, people are just more informed. And so I'm glad for that, because there really was some good stuff on here. But if you are going to try to buy the actual physical versions of the games, just know that you're getting into some pretty pricey territory here for what they cost. But, emulation, it emulates pretty well. So that's definitely another route too also. But coming in at number 12 is the Microsoft Xbox 360. And with the 360, I like the system. I played it quite a bit, actually, back in the day. It was a system that I used a lot to play a lot of like the third-party games that were coming out on the 7th generation, which there was a lot of them. And the 7th generation is really defined a lot by a lot of these third-party games, like anything from like Assassin's Creed, Red Dead Redemption, Batman, Arkham Asylum, and the Grand Theft Auto 4, Mass Effect, Grand Theft Auto 5 also came out on the 7th generation. And so many of them were third-party, which meaning, they came out on some of the other systems. But but a lot of them just felt more at home on the 360. So that's where I played a lot of them. There was on the 360 and all, and they they tended to play a little bit better. They ran a little bit better on the 360. Not so much later on into that generation's lifetime because the PlayStation 3 was catching up, to being able to play these games pretty well. And it also had games like the Gears of War series, which I absolutely love, and then Halo 3 and Halo Reach were really good games as well too. But the reason I don't place this one higher was because even though I played a lot of the third generation games or third party games on this system, again, a lot of them could be played on the PlayStation 3 also. And as like I said, as the PlayStation 3, as its lifetime started going along, it was able to keep up with the Xbox 360 to at least make the versions of, the multi-plat games pretty comparable to the 360 as well too. But there wasn't just a whole lot of like exclusives on it because like it had BioShock, but then eventually that went over to the PlayStation, and then it had Mass Effect, but that went over to the PlayStation. Gears of War and Halo are great, but then that's, there's not a whole lot more to it, right? That I couldn't play elsewhere. And but the Xbox 360 started off really strong, which was really gamer centric at first. But then once the Kinect started getting introduced, which would have been around, 2010, 2011 or so, Microsoft just kind of started shifting in a different direction. And it just seems that the leadership that was involved and all that, they were just going in a different way and all, which ultimately ended up leading to the debacle that was the Xbox One and then where we're at right now. And so, it is what it is now. And, Microsoft doing something different nowadays, which is cool, I guess, for at least the way I game. But as far as like the uniqueness of the console, which is kind of what this countdown is all about, I really liked what it was doing and all, but there's just not a whole lot of like exclusives on there, right, that I can say to go back to. And the hardware itself was really faulty. Well, the original one, because I ended up getting the Slim afterwards, and that one ends up holding up pretty well. But if I'm thinking about like the systems in this generation, I played it a lot, but I could have played a lot of these games on the PlayStation 3. And then I'll talk more about that system in its time. But basically, it's a really good system and all, and I do have a lot of fond memories of it. But when I think on its own, it just was lacking a lot of like unique games on, for the system itself, right? That I could play somewhere else, basically. That's what I'm trying to get at. But either way, great system. And I can see why this is a lot of people's not only favorite Microsoft system or Xbox system, but also one of their favorite systems of all time. Because I can imagine like if you played Xbox Live, like I'm not an online gaming gamer, but if you did, I can see how you would have had a lot of fun memories of that. So I can definitely see how this might place a little bit higher for you if you were someone that would play online games at the time. Because it seems like that was just the place to be, right, and all for online gaming back in the day. But at number 11, I have the Sega Dreamcast. And the Sega Dreamcast, it was probably the system that it's weird to say about a gaming console, but it kind of broke my heart with everything that happened to it and all, because it was a good system. It had, to me, in my opinion, the best launch ever of a video game with the games that I had available for it. Just a lot of great stuff, and admittedly, a lot of arcade style games, right? But just a lot of cool stuff though on it, and I was so excited when the system came out. I was like, Sega's back, we're in this again and all, only for all of that to come crashing down like about a year and a half later or so. But what was 1999 when the system came out, and even in 2000, because it had a decent year in 2000. There was a lot of great stuff on there. It gave me hope, right, and all that Sega was back in it and all. But at the end of the day, the mistakes of Sega's past just came back to haunt it, and Sega ended up bowing out of the console race. This would have been in early 2001, I believe. When they made the announcement anyways. But for what it is, the amount of games that came out on there that are really fun titles and all, it was pretty impressive. And still games that are talked about to this day. And eventually a lot of these games ended up coming over to some of the other systems. And then also there was also games that came out on the other systems that seemed like they might have been in development for the Dreamcast, because there was like Virtua Fighter 5. I don't know if that one would have come out on the Dreamcast and all, but it shortly came out on the PlayStation 2. So you almost think that maybe it was planned for the Dreamcast. But then things like Panzer Dragoon Orta, Shenmue 2. Well, that did come out in Europe, but maybe it would have made its way to the States had the Dreamcast been more successful. And then things like Gun Valkyr, Jet Set Radio Future, Toe Jam and Earl. Some other games that ended up coming out again on the other systems and all from Sega that you almost think that it would have come out on this. And nothing truly groundbreaking and all, but you just got the feeling that the Dreamcast definitely had more life after it, if it just wasn't because of Sega's mistakes, right? And all that made it bow out early. But for what it is, it's definitely a great system. Not my favorite Sega system, but it's a great system and all that. Unfortunately, its lifetime was just cut too short. And oh yeah, the Dreamcast. Rest in peace. Let's see. But number 10, though, I have the Microsoft Xbox. So the OG Xbox. And I have this one over the 360 because I really felt that this one just had more exclusives to it that were unique to the system that made the system stand out to me more amongst its competition. Because during the sixth generation, which had just a lot, the four major systems of the Dreamcast, the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and the Xbox, they were all really great systems. And for me, they were all very different, where you can get a different flavor, so to speak, right, with each one. And what I got with the Xbox was more Western-centric games, more American-style games, more kind of PC-style games. And it was also the place to play like first-person shooters and all, because they just, for me personally, I just felt that they played a little bit better with the offset analog sticks. And the triggers also just felt better for playing first-person shooters and even racing games and all. And it just had more games and all that I feel were unique to the system. Like, so Halo, Halo 1 and 2, of course. And then at the time, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, the Elder Scrolls, Fable. So again, games that felt like they could be on a PC, and several of them were, but they were on a console. And so that to me made the system very unique. And so it was sort of my introduction to have a curiosity in PC gaming, which I still kind of have. I have a bit of a curiosity for PC gaming and all, but this sort of started the process of me dabbling a bit in PC gaming, because then I got, eventually interested in things like Doom 3 and Half-Life 2, which I played originally on the Xbox, which were, for the time, decent ports. I just feel like the system was more of a unique had more of a unique identity than any of the other Microsoft systems, and that's why I placed this one higher. And I had a great time with it. Again, it was one of the four pillars of that sixth generation, which is the banger of a generation. And it's not my favorite one from that. I like it slightly more than the Dreamcast, but mainly just because it had a longer lifetime. And but then again, it almost felt kind of like a Dreamcast 2 in a way, right? With some of the games that came out on there first from Sega. And so and then I also like the hardware of the customized soundtracks and all that. I thought was really revolutionary at the time. And yeah, I had a lot of fun memories on the Xbox. And also at the same time too, it's outside of like the Xbox exclusives that I was playing on it, it was also my go-to for playing third-party games because they looked a little bit better. And then also at the time with the setup that I had, most of the games were going to output in progressive scan. Most of the games were going to have Dolby Digital on there because I had a stereo system and TV set up for all that. And so the games were, again, they would not only run a little bit better and all that, but also, it could just output at a higher resolution and the sound would be a little bit better. Not in all cases, but in a lot of cases. So yeah, I had a fun time with the Xbox, and I miss that Microsoft Xbox. I do. It was a cool system. But coming in at number 9 though is another one from the sixth generation, and that's the Nintendo GameCube. And I mean, I have the Sega Dreamcast, Xbox, and GameCube almost neck and neck because I really felt that they were, they had a lot to offer and all that, and they were very unique. So with the GameCube, we had a lot of quality Nintendo games on there. And I mean, everything from, Super Smash Bros, Melee, Melee, and then the Wind Waker, and Eternity, Super Mario Sunshine, which it's not my favorite 3D Mario game, but it's still fun. And Mario Kart Double Dash, I had a fun time with that one. A lot of the Nintendo sports games, for a while, Resident Evil was this was the home for Resident Evil, and then also like Eternal Darkness. That's another great game. And then, of course, Metroid Prime. Oh God, I love that game so much. And it was, I mean, the graphics on it were really impressive. I liked the controller for it when came to like the Nintendo exclusive games on it, which is mainly what I had the system for, and it just worked beautifully with those games. And it was just a system that was just to play games, right? Where sometimes with some of these systems, and it started in this generation going forward, because you can do so much more on it, like, watch YouTube, Netflix, and all that. Sometimes you get a little distracted when you're on the system. You're like, maybe I'll just put on YouTube instead of playing a game. When you play the GameCube, and this is true for a lot of the Nintendo systems, is that because they're limited on other options as far as that's outside of gaming, you're going to play games on it, right? And that's what I do appreciate about a lot the Nintendo systems. Although on the Switch you can, do YouTube. But anyways, yeah, so I really like the GameCube. Had not the biggest library, but the stuff that was on there, especially from Nintendo, had some really great stuff. F-Zero, GX also. I really like Star Fox Adventures, and yeah, I had a great time with the system, and I feel like the quality of the Nintendo games and all puts this a little bit higher than the Dreamcast and the Xbox for that generation. But all three of those really are kind of neck and neck, and as you can see, right, I have them, ranked back to back on these. Let's see, but then coming in at number 8, I have the Sony PlayStation 4, and the 8th generation was, for me personally, it's kind of where video games started changing a bit, that they started doing a lot of certain practices that I'm not the biggest fan of, but I can't deny, though, that the PlayStation 4 did have a lot of great games on there, and again, exclusive games, and it was my system that I was mainly on during that stretch there of the 8th generation, because, like I said, the Xbox One, I would get it for, was very small, like Gears of War mainly, and then the Halo Master Chief Collection. I mean, that was cool too. And then I would use the Xbox, especially when I got the Xbox One X for like third-party stuff, because they would look a little bit better on there. But for the most part, I was on the PlayStation 4, and and that was for not only playing games, but also my Netflix and YouTube machine as well too. But even with those other options on there and all that, right, I still played quite a bit of games on this PlayStation 4, and it just had a lot of great exclusives on there. And again, that's kind of what I'm, as this list starts going along, I know that there's a lot of talk about like exclusivity and all that. And, I mean, the gaming industry is changing, and, I can maybe talk about that at some other point, as far as like that we just don't really have exclusives on that and all. Is that a good thing or bad thing? And I mean, ultimately it is what it is. At the end of the day, I just kind of want to play games, but I do miss the uniqueness of these systems, right? And all, where they have like their own kind of games and all that. I do miss that. I'm not going to lie. And it's just because this is what I grew up with, and all this is just sort of what I am. It's not that I'm not open to like different approaches. It's just where I'm at as far as, what I grew up with, what I'm used to. And the PlayStation 4 had a lot of great, unique, exclusive games on there. God of War, the Spider-Man, Ghost of Tsushima, Days Gone, and Little Big Planet, and just a lot of great stuff on there. That Horizon, Zero Dawn, all great games, all pushing the boundaries at the time of story, like what Sony became popular for, right? Especially in this generation of more narrative focused games, which is sort of what I lean towards a lot, but still really fun games to play as well too. And they were just really great experiences. Final Fantasy VII, remake, just and also The Last of Us Part 2. It had a lot of great exclusives on there, and yeah, I mean, it's if it wasn't because of the PlayStation 4, I mean, the 8th generation would have started to feel a bit, I don't know, like a little doom and gloom, I guess, in certain ways. But for what it is, though, and all, I definitely think that it's, well, I mean, because there was a Nintendo Switch too also. So Nintendo, that was kind of doing its own thing too. But I guess as far as I'm talking about, I guess like the more higher end stuff and all that, and Nintendo kind of does their own thing. But the PlayStation 4 really was the place to be, right, for those kind of games. And I'm glad for that because I kind of felt like we lost Microsoft as a competitor during this generation, where I was usually, starting mainly with the sixth generation, right? And all, no, well, actually, no, more with the fifth generation, where I was used to having at least three main competitors. With the eighth generation, it kind of only felt like Sony and Nintendo in a lot of ways. And I think that's why I don't have this generation ranked as highly as some others. But what was on the PlayStation 4 and all that, right? Definitely some cool stuff. So it's definitely worth checking out the library for on the PlayStation 4. And now coming in at number 7 is the Sega Saturn. I love this system. I think it's great. It's again, a lot of it is nostalgia and all that, but it was the 5th generation system that I first owned. So it was kind of my main system for a while there until we eventually we didn't jump ship to the PlayStation, but we got the PlayStation. But for, the Sega Saturn, though, I feel it is still a very good system. And one of the reasons that I rank it fairly high here is because it had a lot of unique games onto it that even to this day, you can't really play anywhere else. And they're quality games too also. And, it's just unfortunate that a lot of the mistakes that Sega made ended up carrying over to this one. I already talked about the 32X and all that. And so I think that didn't help the Sega Saturn's chances. But then also Sony made a lot of moves too also, right? It wouldn't have beat it. I really don't think that and all. But I still feel with all the mistakes that Sega was making and all the things stacked against the Saturn, like it was very difficult to program for. So meaning that the graphics weren't coming out as good as the PlayStation, which was kind of a big deal during this time because we were going into 3D. And so it's a new frontier. And if your first impression isn't good, it's not going to hook people. And so that's why a lot of people ended up going to the PlayStation and then, to some extent the Nintendo 64 also. And it was just unfortunate for that because the Sega Saturn could do some pretty good 3D in the right hands. Because technically, from my understanding, it was a more powerful machine than the Sony PlayStation. It's just that the PlayStation was just much more easier to program for. And so therefore, the developers could get more out of it. But what the Sega Saturn could do, and my taste in games still, because I was a big Sega fan and all, is I still felt that it was a very top quality system because I got a lot of great Sega games on there, kind of more of their arcade stuff. And I do miss a lot of the big series that they had on the previous generation, like Streets of Rage, for example, and Sonic, Sonic being a big one. At least it didn't have like an original game on there. But then also things like, we had a Shinobi game, which was Shinobi Legions is actually pretty good, but it wasn't quite the Shinobi game that I wanted and all. And just more, I guess I just wanted more of those kind of Sega games on there, what we didn't really get. We got a lot of great arcade ports, like Sega Rally Championship, Virtua Fighter 2, Virtual Cop, things like that, which was great. I just kind of wish that we would have got more original Sega games too, like we were getting on the Sega Genesis. And then the sports library was unfortunately lacking. But even with all that stuck against it, we still had a lot of great games on here and that are very original, very fun, like Knights, Guardian Heroes, all those arcade ports that I mentioned. And then it was a place to play like a lot of the Capcom 2D fighters. And had things like a stall also, which I know I'm a big fan of. And even though it wasn't the main RPG system at the time, but we still had things like Shining Force 3, the Panzer Dragoon series, Magic Knight Ray Earth, Shining the Holy Dark. So, it had a lot of good stuff on there. It's just unfortunate that, Sega just couldn't really market this system well, that it just ended up, kind of getting lost in time now, but at least at the time, because this is another system too that has been having a bit of a resurgence and all. And there's a lot of there's a cult following to the system now, which I think is great because again, it was a system that I felt really deserved that. And so I'm glad to see that there's a lot of cool ways you can play the Sega Saturn now. Like if you mod your system a little bit, you can get the games like on there's like this thing that I've seen that you can remove the optical drive to replace it with some kind of a drive that has an SD card and you just load up your ROMs on there, things like that, right? And all it. And so I'm just really glad that there's a lot of cool ways to play it. People are being more aware of the Sega Saturn. I wish more of the games would be re-released because really the only ones that have had like a re-release that were Saturn exclusives that you can play like on modern systems now is what, Knights and Guardian Heroes. I mean, you can play like Virtua Fighter 2 and all, but it's like the arcade version. I really wish that there was the games exclusive to the Saturn, or those versions, anyways, that would come out somehow in a re-release. But I guess a lot of it just has to do with, at the end of the day, they just didn't really sell that well. But yeah, but I really have a lot of fondness for the system, and I'm so glad that it's getting a bit of a resurrection nowadays. But coming in at number 6, I have the Sony PlayStation 3. And with the PlayStation 3, it eventually ended up becoming my favorite 7th generation system because it started off slow. I mentioned before that the Xbox 360 was my place to play games at that time. But then around I'm gonna say that it started kind of with 2008 was Metal Gear Solid 4. And then in 2009, we started getting some games on it. Like there was Uncharted 2, and I believe Infamous came out. And then after that, we were just getting like a lot of great games, Killzone and, the follow-ups to the Uncharted series, and then Resistance series also, I think, started with part 1 was okay, but then part 2 in 2008, I think, and all, and then part 3 and all. And we're getting a lot of cool exclusives on there. And then the third party, the multiplayer games and all the ports of those games were getting really comparable, if not, pretty much the same as they were on the Xbox 360. And so then that's why the system stands out more to me, is again because of the original games that you can play at that time. Some of them, again, still locked to the system, like Metal Gear Solid 4, for example. But yeah, a lot of great exclusives that the system ended up having. And also that it was a Blu-ray player, that was a big deal as well too back then. But I know that kind of seemed almost like cheating because has nothing really to do with video games, but the games themselves were really cool and all, and definitely it was a place to go to. And even online multiplayer. I've never been much of an online gamer, but because it was free, I dabbled in a few games here and there because of that. I was like, I'll check it out, and all. And so it's a great system. I still actually keep mine around because, again, there's certain games on there that I can't really play elsewhere, or certain multiplayer games that unfortunately you can't play on the Xbox, like through its backwards compatible. So, for example, like the Transformers, War of Cybertron and Fall of Cybertron, I keep those on the PlayStation 3 because I don't have my 360 anymore, and because I would have rather have played them there because they ran a little bit better on there. But I still keep my PlayStation 3 around, so I have those versions of those games there just because, again, I can't play them elsewhere. And then also like the Killzone games too. Also, I love those games, and I can't play them elsewhere either. Metal Gear Solid 4. But yeah, a lot of great games. Again, it was the system to be on for, at least I feel, for multiplats, and also the exclusive. So, I mean, ultimately, if you had to choose between the Xbox 360 and all, or the PlayStation 3, this is why the PlayStation 3 for me wins out, is again because of the exclusive that I had. Outside that, because like I said, eventually the multiplayer games and all, they played fine on there. Like I did play Batman Arkham Asylum and Red Dead Redemption on there, which from what I've heard, they ran a little bit better on the 360, but I had a great time with them on the PlayStation 3. So, but yeah, that was a great system, and definitely one of the more better PlayStation consoles that were out there. But at number 5, I have my beloved Sega Genesis. And the Sega Genesis, this is it almost hurt me putting it at number 5, not higher, because it's the system that I have the most nostalgia for. It's, I would have been 8 years old. No, I'm sorry, not 8, around 9 years old to about 15 years old or so, 16 or so, the stretch that I mainly played on the Sega Genesis, and just had a lot of great memories with this system. It was my system that it was my Super Nintendo, so to speak, right? Because I know a lot of people grew up with that, and it was part of the console wars, and all, and it, for me, was just had so many great games on there. A lot of the Sega stuff that was coming out was just great, like the Sonic games, obviously, the Streets of Rage, Gunstar Heroes, the Shinobi games, Landstalker, Shining Force 1 and 2, the Contra and Castlevania games that came out on there, and just a lot of other miscellaneous games too, like Rocket Knight Adventures, And let's see, the Ronald McDonald game of all games right now that I thought was really great. A lot of cool platformers, which again, admittedly, some of them took after Sonic, but like High Seas Havoc and Socket, Mega Turrican was I feel like had the best version of that game on the Sega Genesis. Um, just such a great system. Lightning Force, a lot of great shooters on like shoot 'em ups on there. Pretty comparable ports of Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat. Um, just so many great things. And if it wasn't as good as a Super Nintendo, and like on some of the multiplayer games, they would still hold their own, and in some cases be even better. Like probably the more infamous one is Aladdin, and yeah, just a lot of great games on there. So many great memories with that system, and it's the system that for me is probably the funnest when it comes to just pick up and play, because a lot of the games they just feel really fast paced, just a lot of fun. And it's really like I pick up the game so many times. Well, like through emulation or on like compilations and all that that I can play on modern systems. But I just love going back to this library of games and all, just because I just love the simplicity of the games, the fast paced nature of the games, the music on some of these games and all when they did it right, like things like Streets of Rage 2 or Lightning Force and all. I mean, they're just excellent soundtracks. The Adventures of Batman and Robin of all games. I mean, that game was just a killer soundtrack, and it's very fast paced and all, which not very Batman like, but it's still awesome. So yeah, definitely probably my favorite system that I love going back to if I just want to just pick up and play some games and all and just have fun with. Love that system so much, and it kind of hurt me to say that I have it on number 5, but the reason is because the next 4 systems that I have on here, I mean, I put them in this order, but I'm still conflicted about it because I can kind of switch them around, honestly. And just because they were really a cut above the norm. For that reason, also only mainly is just why I had to put the Sega Genesis on number 5, just because I can't deny the awesomeness of these next 4 systems. Because again, the next 4 systems that I'm going to mention, I have them in this order, but I can, on a given day, I could probably switch them around. But coming in at number 4 was the other console that was part of the console wars of back in the day, and that's the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. And I mean, back then I was all about Sega and all that, and I love that system a lot. But when I started getting my hands on some of the Super Nintendo games, I was like, okay, this is cool too also, but in a different way, right? Because again, Sega games were very fast-paced, fun, pick up and play, you have a blast and all, where the Super Nintendo, it had some games like that too also, right? But it had also games that I started really going more towards, like RPGs, adventure games and all. And so once I started playing games like Super Metroid and Final Fantasy 3, as it was known at the time, Chrono Trigger, I mean, those games right there were just with those 3 games right there, it just made it a cut above, right? A Link to the Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, but then also had some fun like platformers, obviously with Super Mario World, Donkey Kong Country series, Super Punch-Out, F-Zero, and then also a lot of the third-party game, the multiplayer games and all, they generally looked and played better on the Super Nintendo, not always. But also there was just more third-party exclusive games on the Super Nintendo too. And it's just because the Super Nintendo was still the system to go to at the time where developers wanted to put most of their games at. And for me, the system started off a little weak. No, I'm sorry, it didn't start off weak. It started off pretty strong. And then around its middle of its lifetime, it wasn't bad. It's just, I don't know, I feel like that's where the Sega Genesis really kicked ass. But then from 1994 going forward, though, until like 1996 and all, when it was really market relevant, it just came out with a lot of great all-time greats. And I just can't overlook that. I mean, the Super Nintendo just had a lot of great stuff on there, and it's an amazing system and definitely one of the best of all time. And like I said, right, these next 4 that I'm talking about here, I can flip-flop them around because they were just all excellent. Because coming in at number 3 is the Sony PlayStation, the original one. And this system, to me, kind of took the best of the what the Sega Genesis was as far as like its marketing and attitude and everything like that, but also being like the Super Nintendo where it was a system where pretty much all the major third party games were going to as well too. Now, obviously, the PlayStation didn't have the Nintendo games and all, but pretty much everything else was on the PlayStation, or at least the games that you really wanted to play. And it just ended up having a legendary library from a company that wasn't really originally doing video games at first. At least that wasn't its sole purpose. I mean, they were doing video games. It wasn't like, they weren't like a Sega or a Nintendo, but somehow they found a way to get some developers on board that really made the system stand out and make the system unique. Like Namco and Psygnosis, were really important at the start, right? And all for the system to get going. And then eventually Capcom and Konami with their series, like Metal Gear Solid, Silent Hill, Suikoden, and then eventually Resident Evil, and things like that. It was the place to go to, right, for like the big third-party games. And then, of course, the biggest blow of them all that really kind of sealed the deal for the PlayStation, in my opinion, was Squaresoft with Final Fantasy VII, which, it's my favorite game of all time. And so it just, what that game did to not only to the industry, but to me personally, was just a big nuclear bombshell that went off as far as like my interest in the gaming and all, how it just blew up to say like, games can really be something else on a different level. And this is where it really started, right? Because I was already a big fan of gaming coming up to this system. But the Sony PlayStation, though, really cemented that. And then we followed it up shortly after was Castlevania Symphony of the Night. For me, the greatest 2D game of all time. And then the following year was Metal Gear Solid, which is, one of my favorite games of all time, too, also. And just a legendary lineup of a lot of like arcade kind of games, a lot of RPGs, a lot of platformers. It had something for everyone. And it's no wonder why it ended up selling over 1 million units, I believe. I think it was the first system, I believe, that sold over 1 million. And Sony they did it right, and some of the things I'm not the biggest fan of sort of the way how a company can come in that's not a video game company, but change things around, because eventually I think it's kind of led to where things are at nowadays. But at the same time, I don't know how well the video game industry how well it would have hung on if it wasn't for a company like this to come in. They had the big bucks and the big marketing push behind it and all that, made gaming mainstream, for better or worse, right? Again, I don't know, whether that's good or bad and all that, but, because gaming became so successful the way it is now was really because of the system here. And yeah, just a great system overall. And then it was followed up by my number 2, which was the Sony PlayStation 2. And pretty much everything that I said about the PlayStation can be applied to this one, only now Sony was getting a lot of exclusive developers that were making games for it that were on par with what Nintendo was doing, right? And, and back in the day, Sega, with series like Ratchet and Clank, Jak and Daxter, Sly Cooper, God of War, a lot of these developers like Santa Monica Studios, Sucker Punch, Insomniac Games, and Naughty Dog, they were kind of becoming like the Sony developers and all, and it started giving Sony its identity now. And same thing like with the PlayStation 1, that's where a lot of the cool third-party games were being at, and just so many great games on this system. And it's still the top-selling system of all time. Granted, a lot of that is because of the DVD player. That is definitely, can't deny that. But it had a legendary library as well, too. So I don't know if it would have sold as many consoles as it did without the DVD player. I mean, it wouldn't have. It wouldn't have. I'm just, but I still feel it would have sold quite a bit, though, because that was a very legendary library, too. And kind of the same thing with the PlayStation 1 is that it just had something for everyone. Just so many great games on there, like from platformers, RPGs, had some online gaming on it, racing games, sports games, and what have you, right? I mean, it was all there. You would find something on this system. It was all there, and it was the fourth pillar in that sixth generation of gaming that was just truly legendary. And I mean, it had a great lineup of games, right? It really did. And so I placed that one at my number 2. And my number 1 that I have on here, and it's the Nintendo Switch. Now, this one, it's a bit maybe controversial to me why I have it on here. And I say that because the system on its own, like the exclusives and all that and all, are pretty good, right? The Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Odyssey, Metroid Dread, it had great games that were on the system, and then you get the best of the Wii U games, right, and all that came out on this, and were even better. And it was so it had a pretty good lineup on its own. But the reason I have it as my number one, and again, that's what I'm saying, I can flip-flop between these top four pretty easily, on any given day. But I place it at number one for right now, just because outside of those games on the exclusives that you can play on the Switch, it just had a lot of great games that you can play on there that are some of my all-time favorites. And because a lot of these other systems that I've been mentioning, some of the best games that were on these systems, I can play a version of it on the Switch. Not necessarily maybe the best version, but a comparable enough version, and that it's a hybrid system, being that, you can have it docked and play on the TV or play it in handheld mode. That to me right there is a big deal. And the fact that I can just carry this thing around and have just some of my all-time favorite games on there just in the palm of my hands, it was truly, I think, revolutionary for me. And I love that system for that. So it kind of feels weird placing it number one, because the exclusives themselves on the Switch are not bad by no means, but it's definitely probably not my favorite system. But just the fact that I can play so many games on there, right, and all in handheld mode as well too, really elevates the experience of the system to another level for me. And that's why I have it as my number one. But like I said, my top four between the Super Nintendo, PlayStation 2, and Switch, I honestly, I can flip-flop these around, right? And I would almost say like all of them are my number one. But I just had to rank them in some order. But that's what I have. Again, I didn't, there's some systems here obviously missing and all, but those I feel like are like the main ones. And with the other systems, anything else that would have been out there, like would have really added the, what's it called, the Wii, no. So, but yeah, that's where I have these systems ranked. And the Switch too, I have it. I guess I'm curious to see how that system's lifetime will pan out. It's still pretty new. It's only been out for what 2-3 months or so. So I can't really say how the system's going to do, but I'm liking it so far, outside of some business practices and all that. Right. But for the most part, what the system is and all that. Right. And I'm liking it so far. And if it ends up being kind of this, like a Switch, where it has a lot of great Nintendo games, but also I can play just a lot of my all-time favorites on it, it can be up there for a contender, one of my favorite systems of all time. Right. I guess just depending on a lot of the way the video game industry ends up shaping out, because what Nintendo is doing right now is not just exclusive to Nintendo. That's just the video game industry as a whole right now. But if I'm just talking about just the games, the experience and it on there and all, I am liking the Switch too. But yeah, that's what I got from my favorite consoles of all time. And let me know what yours are. What are your top 5 at least favorite consoles of all time? Share your thoughts. But until then, till the next.